Hello, my name is Rinon, and today I'm making a video that is a little bit different to the standard style. So I've talked quite a lot recently, both in podcasts and on my own videos, about the way that healing is right now in Final Fantasy XIV, and I've been thinking a lot as well about the way that healing is maybe going to be in the next expansion with the release of Dawntrail. And I feel like something that for a lot of viewers of mine and a lot of Final Fantasy XIV players in general, a lot of the things that they don't have is context, because I think a large percentage of players started playing the game in Shadowbringers, maybe even in Endwalker, maybe as far back as Stormblood, but there are actually a very small number of players that have been consistently playing all the way since A Realm Reborn or Heavensward. And the game has changed a lot since then. So what I wanted to do today, what I thought would be quite interesting and fun, is I am going to watch an old POV of my own gameplay from early Heavensward, from when I first hit endgame. And I'm going to talk about the way that healing has changed, both as a job and in terms of your fight responsibilities, in terms of the things that you can do, your priorities, things like that. One thing to bear in mind, this was my first ever endgame content clear of Thorden Extreme the week that it released. I'm not good at the game here. This is when I very first started playing. I had no idea what to do. Guides were not as easily available as they are now. You're going to see a lot of these things and you're going to cringe. And I'm going to cringe too. And that's just how it is. Also, this is not a scripted video. I haven't written what I'm going to say here. I'm kind of winging it by ear, so if I kind of stumble over myself a little bit, I do apologize. Can't really help it. Yeah, let's talk about it. Okay, so before we actually start playing the video, I want to talk about what you can see on screen here on the YouTube video, because there's a lot of things that you can decipher just based off of this without even pulling the boss or watching a single footage of movement that has changed a lot from now. The first thing you want to look at is the party list, and you can see two buffs right here on the party list that you may not see now. Those are Protect and Stone Skin. The way that Protect and Stone Skin used to work is they are buffs that can be applied by the healers pre-pull. Protect gives you, I think it's a 10% damage reduction in general. And Stone Skin is essentially a single target shield. They also added a Stone Skin 2, which allows you to AoE shield, but you could only use it outside of combat. The thing about Stone Skin and Protect is, what I thought was a big issue with them is that they were kind of intended to pad the amount of time that you spent in between pulls. Bear in mind that back in Heavensward, there was no cooldown reset on your abilities when you wiped or respawned or rezoned into an instance. So let's say you hit hallowed ground, you would have to wait 7 minutes even if you wiped before you could pull again and use that hallowed ground again. On top of that, these abilities would need to be used out of combat before you could actually pull the boss. You would need to individually apply Stone Skin to 8 different people before access to Stone Skin 2 existed. And also, whenever a player dies in combat, they lose their Protect buff, meaning that they will need a new Protect reapplied in order to get the 10% damage mitigation. Stuff like that was quite important in Heavensward, and it's a real far cry from the way that things are now, where you can just kind of, you go in, you start like a 15-20 second pull macro, everyone does their pre-pull and you go. It wasn't really like that back then. You had to do a lot of setup before you could pull. We can also look over to my White Mage hotbars here, and you can see that there are 3 dots on the hotbar all at once. All 3 stone skills are on the hotbar all at once as well. These don't automatically replace and overwrite one another, and all 3 dots have their use in current endgame content at this point in the game. I released a video quite recently. As I'm recording this, I released the video today about dots in Final Fantasy XIV and the way that they used to be and the way that I feel that they should be going forward, and that I think there's some issues with the way that FF14 currently handles dots. Well, the way things work here is you have 3 dots with different timers, different cast times, things like that, and you have to manage all of them, and it makes your rotation way more active than the way that it used to be. You also see this little blue thing here, this is Fluid Aura. This does damage. It does damage and a knockback. This is part of your rotation. Assise is still a damaging and healing skill, but its damage or healing depends on this red and black button here that you may recognize as Cleric stance. When you're in Cleric stance, all of your damage skills do full damage, but all of your healing skills do like 10% of their potency or something like that. And when you're not in Cleric stance, all of your healing skills do full potency, but all of your damage skills do like 10% of their potency. And Assai's when in Cleric stance does damage and very little healing, and when not in Cleric stance does healing but very little damage. So it works a little bit differently than the way that it does currently, where you get to double dip on both rewards for free. This is kind of a trend in Heavensward. You often had a bit of a risk reward to almost anything you did. In order to be able to DPS, you had to sacrifice being able to heal, and turning off Cleric stance to heal would sacrifice your DPS. You also need to bear in mind that when you turn Cleric stance on, you cannot turn it off for 5 seconds. So if something happens, like you turn Cleric stance on, you apply your dot, and then you see that somebody drops super low all of a sudden, or a tank takes a tank buster and you haven't prepared for it in advance, you are locked into Cleric stance. You cannot heal him for a few seconds. You have no instant way of dealing with that problem. But you're going to see throughout this video that that's actually a trend in general, that jobs have so much less ability to instantly deal with a problem. They have to have a lot more foresight because you rely a lot more on GCDs. Okay, I've waffled for like 6 minutes straight, so let's watch the video, okay? Okay, so we're going to watch the pull macro. One thing to bear in mind with the tanks here as well, this is DPS stance. Tanks have DPS stance and tank stances. So you see here, I go into Cleric stance, I apply my dots. I'm a very unconfident player, so I apply my dots and immediately swap out of Cleric stance. One thing I do want to note here, we'll go back a few seconds. You'll see here, look at how different the AoEs look here compared to normal. If you went to Thorden Extreme now, the AoEs would not look like this. I think that one thing that Square Enix has improved on so bloody much since the way that things were back in Heavensward and even Stormblood is visibility and how clear things are. You can see AoEs much clearer now. You can see buffs much clearer now. You can see everything much clearer now. You get information in a much easier fashion compared to back then. You can also see here, if you look here, this is a Suna. This is Shroud of Saints, which you may recognize as Lucid Dreaming. Back then, there were no homogenized skills like that. Every job had their own independent versions of those abilities. The same is true for tanks with Rampart. Rampart was only for one tank. Every other tank had their own independent cooldowns that they would use in that situation. I'm using a lot of Cure 2 here, like a lot of Cure 2. The gaze mechanic is coming in. I think that this may be a little bit interesting as well, because Thorden Unreal is going to be the next Unreal trial coming in, so you can get a bit of an idea of how the fight was on content. You can also see what a purely unconfident player I am in terms of damage, because as soon as a mechanic happens, I immediately stop DPS it. But that kind of attitude is what Heavensward used to foster in players. I actually think it was fairly regular that the regen healer would be the quote-unquote main healer, and the shield healer would be the quote-unquote off healer, which was an awful mentality. But it was one that was normalized in Heavensward very much due to the fact that you couldn't instantly react to a problem so easily. Another thing to bear in mind, look how hard this tank buster hits. Wait for it. We wait a bit more. Heavenly Heal is the buster. That's a hard-hitting tank buster. To be fair, he definitely could have... He had a lot of cooldowns, actually. He had Rampart. He had Shadow Wall, was it? He had a lot. This is a bit of a downtime mechanic, there's not too much to talk about here. Cleric stance goes on, the dots go up, the DPS comes out, we hit the fluid aura, big damage. There's not really much happening in this phase at all. This is a bit of a downtime phase before we go into the ad phase, which will be a lot more scary. So one thing you can see here on White Mage, also on all of the other healers, they have no job gauge. Most jobs in this game at this point, well, all jobs in this game had no job gauge, and most jobs had no gauge of any form that they would build up. White Mage only has access to their GCD abilities for the most part. Their instants are single target instants like Tetra and Benediction. They have Asylum, but this is before the Asylum buffs and changes, so the Asylum is absolutely tiny. It's a tiny, look at it here, you see it go up. This is a tiny, tiny field regen. It's so small that you essentially have to have the group actively stacked to fit players inside of it. You can't just chuck down the Asylum and everybody gets a regen. And because you don't have access to instants, in order to heal these players that are taking individual chip damage from the meteor, you need to rely on your GCDs because your instants just aren't enough. There is a much, much heavier reliance on GCD healing at this point in the game than there is currently, where the way things are currently are that you want to avoid GCD healing at all costs, and in most fights, aside from maybe current content ultimates, you can afford to avoid GCD healing almost entirely, even in current tier Savage. You can't do that. There is always going to be a situation in endgame contents in Heavensward where you need at least 1 or 2 GCD heals to get through safely. We're just clearing up the second ad here. You see here I put up Virus, which is essentially Adel. It's a cross-class for Virus from, what is it, Scholar? Or Arcanist even. And that's another thing. As a White Mage, I can cross-class that mitigation skill from the DPS job. I have access to Virus from Arcanist. So I can put up my own mitigation here, even in Heavensward, to help out. One other thing, we go back here for a second. You saw it just for a second when I swapped hotbars. I want to catch it. Oh, we were right there. Here we go. Here we go. So we can ignore these fairy skills. I don't know why they're there. I'm not going to pretend that I do. Eye for an eye. You can see this ability here that you may not recognize. This is Eye for an Eye, and the way that Eye for an Eye works, the rough strokes because it's been a while. You put Eye for an Eye on one of your allies, usually a tank, and when your ally is attacked, they put a debuff onto the enemy that reduces their attack. So what you can use Eye for an Eye for is it's a very strong double dipping ability because you can put it onto your ally in order to mitigate them, but you need to time it effectively because the debuff does not go onto the enemy until the ally has been hit. So you might want to, say, for example, catch the auto attack before a tank buster or something like that. Fishing for the free cure procs, as you do. Yeah, one thing you see here that is definitely, I'm not going to say it's a problem, but it's something that's a stark contrast from the way that FF14 is currently at the end of Endwalker. When you look at the buff bar, you have almost no information. There are no timers. You have a million buffs because buff bloat was a real issue in Heavensward, and it's really tough to pull out the information that you really want to pull out from any specific buff bar of a player. You also cannot see on the HP bars how much shielding characters have received. You cannot see on the buff bars whether they've received crit shielding or not. You cannot see on the buff bars how long is left on the shield until it expires, unless you specifically highlight the player and check the timers under their individual buff bar. On the party list, you can't access that. So we go into the second phase here, and this is where things get hectic. One thing you'll also notice is that I wouldn't say the damage is insanely high, but these fights, we are not a minimum item level here. These fights hit fairly hard, considering that this is an extreme trial, which is I would say a relatively entry-level encounter in terms of endgame. It hits pretty hard. The boss does quite a lot of damage. I think what this is showing to me more than anything, aside from the way that the game has changed, it's shown me how I as a player have changed a lot. I've gotten a lot better compared to this. I look at this, and one thing that I'd really love to do is I'd almost love to play a Heavensward private server if one was ever available, because I would love to see how I would handle these encounters with the current skill level that I have. I would really love to see if this is job issue, or if this is skill issue, or how much of a mixture of the two it is, or rather game design issue rather than job issue. I wonder if it is possible to push this game to its limits and to optimize the way that you can optimize now, even with the lack of off-global ability, even with the timer lock that Cleric stance provides you, even with the more difficult healing damage rotations. I'd be really curious to see. You also see here, I was taught as a new healer that you always regen the tank when they're taking damage. Keep the regen up on the tank. I'm sure you've heard that advice as well. If you get like an entry-level player and you're like, oh yeah, keep regen up on the tank. That was advice that I got and I followed it to a T until I learned better myself. You see just how much time as a healer you spend outside of Cleric stance. It can be very difficult to keep 100% uptime on your dots. Not because you forgot, but because if a mechanic happens at a specific time that you need to heal for, you are just out of action unless you want to risk the party wiping. So you just have to delay the dots by it. And on the same vein, if another player were to die, they need a reapplication of potentially Stone Skin, but definitely Protect after they die. If I remember correctly as well, White Mages Protect at some point. Maybe this was very early Heavensward or later Realm of War, I can't quite remember. But White Mages Protect was stronger than every other Protect because it was a traded Protect. You had a job trait that made your Protect slightly stronger. Things like, there was a lot of janky stuff like that in the game back then. So if you had, say, Astro Scholar, you would just not have traded Protect. I'm trying to remember if it was Heavensward or later Realm Reborn. It was one of those. This is where 3 raid wides come in, one after another, if I remember correctly, very soon. There's a buster into multiple raid wides. I remember as a new player I was terrified of this moment. This was a scary moment. These raid wides hit quite hard. It's here, it's coming in here. This, in minimum item level on Unreal, is going to be scary. You see, let me go back a moment. Let's look at this. You see that the way when a raid damage hits now, you normally have tons of mitigation. You might have like 5 mits on the boss, or like 3 or 4 mits on the party, or something like that. You just didn't have access to quite that much back then. So what we have here is we have Sucker. I think we're gonna get Soil, maybe. Maybe we'll get Soil. I don't think we have Soil. No, all we had was Sucker. Usually you might get like a few mitigations on the boss. If I remember rightly, this is Path. I think this is a mit. Either I or Path. One of them's a mit. One of them makes the boss do less damage, and I think one makes the player do more damage or something like that. It's been a while. No, one of them's slashing debuff, right? It's been a long time. But that was very much a thing that was the case. I remember that Dark Knight has one as well. There were a lot of jobs that had rotational abilities that would put debuffs on the boss. You could get slashing debuff, you could get piercing debuff from Dragoon, you could get blunt debuff from Monk. But you could also get mitigative effects via your rotation. Which meant that if you failed at your rotation, or if you dropped your rotation, you wouldn't only lose damage, your group would lose mitigation. This is a mitigative effect here. It might be delirium, I don't remember what it's called. But that's from the Dark Knight. Okay, so one of the last mechanics goes out here. Dragon's Gaze, the boss is at 5%. I'm using a lot of Cure 3s, there's a lot of damage going out. This is what was hard about Heavensward healing. It wasn't the pure mechanics, it wasn't the pure damage. It was the fact that you had such limited tools, and even with your limited tools, your job mechanics further limited you from using them whenever you wanted. That's what made healing hard. And that's the end of the fight. So yeah, I hope you got a little bit of a picture of how healing was in Heavensward. It was a lot different to the way things were now, and I think that FF14 learned a lot going forward from Heavensward to Stormblood to Shadowbringers to now. It learned a lot, it got a lot better in the wide strokes, but I think there are absolutely lessons that we can take from old Final Fantasy and potentially bring forward to make the game into an even better, more engaging experience. I'd love to see what you think. Thank you so much for watching, friends. Have a fantastic rest of your days, mornings, or nights. I'll see you next week. Have a good one.